I'm I'm not skilled enough to be both host and presenter at the same time. It's a skill I have not figured out how to do yet. Okay, so there's lots to talk about in Parshas Vayera. Is chock full of all sorts of interesting things. I want to share with you a very simple textual observation that has to do with a city that is addressed in this week's parsha. So we know that Lot is saved from Sodom's destruction, and we know that there were 5 cities. We know from last week's parsha that there was in last week's parsha. We know that there was the war of the 5 kings against the 4 kings, and the 5 kings were Sodom, Amorah, Admah, Tzvayim, and Zoar. And those cities were the cities of the plain. Those were the cities where Lot lived, and those cities were going to be destroyed. So what's interesting is that there's when Lot is saved, so he's told by the Malach, by the angel that saves him, he's told that that do not stand anywhere in the entire plain. Al tamod b'kol hakikar, don't stand in any of the plain. Hahara himaleit, but flee to the mountain. And Lot makes an appeal, and this is really a prayer to Hashem. And that is, he says that he's afraid. He says, I can't go up to the mountain because maybe the evil will pursue me and I'll die. Now, our sages tell us, and Rashi quotes it, that the reason he didn't want to go to the mountain was because that was where Avram Avinu was, and he was afraid to be compared to Avram Avinu. But instead, he says there's a small city here, right? He says, "Hinei na ha'ir hazos krova." If you have a chumash in front of you, you can see it it's in Parak in chapter Yud Tes 19, verse 20. Chaf says, "Hinei ha'ir hazos krova lanu shama v'hi mitzar." He says there's a very close by city, and it's small. Imalta nashama, I like to escape there. Halo mitzar hiu sichi nafshi. He says it's small, and I'll live there. And he's told by, it seems he was actually told by Hashem himself. That's actually a proof that Lot actually was a Navi, he was really a prophet. He says, I've listened to you this, and I'll save this city. I will not overturn that city. So hurry up and escape there, because I can't do anything until you get there. And it says, Al Kain Kara Shem Ha'ir Zoar. That is why this city was called Zoar. And that actually, if you would take a look back at last week's Torah portion, one of the 5 kings is actually not named. It says it refers to him as Melech Bela. He's the king of Bela. He Zoar. That is Zoar. It's the original name of the city was Bela. It was called Zoar. And here in this week's Torah portion, we're told why it was called Zoar. Right here in this pasuk, it says because Lot asked that it should be saved because it's small. Al Kain Kara Shem Ha'ir Zoar. That is why, says the Torah, why the city was named Zoar, because of this plea that he made because of its being small. So what happens? So we're told that Hashemesh Yatzal Aretz, the sun comes out, and Lot but Zoar, and Lot comes to Zoar. He reaches Zoar just in time. Hashem himter al Sodom v'Amorah gafres va'esh. Hashem rains down on Sodom and Amorah sulfur and fire. Me'es Hashem and Hashemayim, from Hashem, from the heavens. Vayafoch es harimael. He overturns, lifts it up like it was on a slab, and turns it over. As kol hakikar, beis kol yoshvei harim, all those who dwelt in those cities. And the pasuk goes on to tell us some of the detail. Now, as we're told, and after Lot being saved, we're told that what happened, Lot got to Zoar. However, in Pasuk Lamed, in the 30th verse, it says, Vayal Lot mitzoar. He went up from Zoar. He left Zoar. Vayeshabar. He ended up going to the mountain. Ushnevno Savimo, and his two daughters were with him. Ki Arelo Sheves B'Zoar. He was still afraid to stay in Zoar. Zoar, it was getting a little too hot for him there. He got afraid that maybe Zoar will also be overturned. It was so close to Sodom. That's what he was worried about. Now, I want to bring up a question, and that is, that's the last we hear about Zoar. He leaves Zoar. He was afraid it's going to also get overturned. The question is, did it get overturned or did it not get overturned? And how will we know whether or not, one way or the other, how will we know whether it got overturned or not? So I want to tell you that it's actually an explicit verse in the Torah that it was not overturned. How do I know that? Much later in the Torah, towards the very end of the Torah, in Parshas Nitzavim, when the Torah is describing how if we sin and the land of Israel becomes desolate, it's compared, the Torah compares it, it says the land of Israel will resemble like the overturning of Sodom, Amorah, Admah, and Tzvayim. That Hashem turned over. That's 4 cities. Those are the 4 out of the 5 cities. The last and 5th city, Zoar, is not mentioned. So you see that in the times of Moshe Rabbeinu, and when we wanted to compare something to the overturning of the cities, we used 4 cities. The 5th city seemingly never got overturned. It never happened, and the fears of Lot were actually unfounded. He didn't need to leave Zoar. Zoar was going to survive, ultimately. That we see from the Pasuk in Nitzavim. It survived. Now, there's actually a whole nother reason that should be obvious that Zoar must have survived. And that was from the verse that I mentioned earlier. In last week's Torah portion, it says, Umelach Bela hi Zoar. It says that the king of Bela, it is Zoar. In other words, it was originally called Bela, and then it has name changed to Zoar. But we saw in just the verses we read before that why was it called Zoar? Because of the statements that and the prayer really of Lot that it should be saved because of mitzar because it's small. It's mitzar. The same word as Zoar. Al kain kara shem ha'ir Zoar. That's why it was called Zoar. So that should tell us, obviously, if it got named Zoar because of something that Lot did, it must have survived because until now, its name was Bela. It only got the new name of Zoar after this incident. So if it didn't survive, it would never have gotten, that name would have never stuck. So obviously, the city must have survived. Otherwise, back in Parshas Lech Lecha, when it says Melach Bela Hit Zoar, it would never call it Zoar. It never got the name Zoar. And here also, it wouldn't say, therefore they called it Zoar. It must have survived. So we don't even need the Parsha, the Pasuk in Nitzavim, in order to be able to prove that Zoar actually survived. And I want to use this point to help us understand a pasuk in last week's portion. When we first hear about Zoar, before the War of the Kings, we are introduced to these cities when Lot makes a decision to go live there. And when the Torah wants to describe those cities, it says, when it wants to describe those cities, it says, Vayisa Lot es Einov. Lot lifted up his eyes, Vayaris kol kikar hayarden. He saw the whole plain of the Jordan. Kikula mashke. It was all watered. Lifnei sheches Hashem. Before Hashem had destroyed es Sodom ves Amorah. Kigan Hashem ke'eretz Mitzrayim. It was like the garden of Hashem, like the land of Egypt. Boachat Zoar. As Rashi explains, Boacha is approaching Zoar, ad Zoar, up until Zoar. And it seems a little strange. What's this Boachat Zoar? Okay, you're describing this place. Sodom Amorah was like the Garden of Hashem. Why are you using this demarcation line or this I can't think of the right word. But why are you thinking of this landmark? That's the word I'm looking for. This landmark of Zoar. So based on what we were saying until now, it's actually very simple why the Torah would use Zoar as a landmark, because of that whole area which got overturned, the only thing that survived was Zoar. So when the Torah was written by Moshe Rabbeinu and it wanted to explain to us what this place used to look like today, in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, it was Kema Pechasadom Vamora. It was like overturned. It was what we see today. And when we go to the area of Yam HaMelach and Sodom, it was all desert. But however, we want to give you a reference point. It's that area up until Zoar. That area in Zoar, because Zoar was still in existence. And since Zoar was in existence, it was a useful and helpful landmark. That's why the Torah says in Parshas Lech Lecha, when it first introduces Sodom and Amorah, it tells us that it was located right by Zoar, because Zoar was an area that survived. I want to talk a little bit about Rabbi Alt. I don't remember what time does this class go till?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself and I hit the camera by accident. No, we normally go until 8:50.
8:50. Okay.
But so you can go a few minutes over if you want.
Oh, well, let me share another idea with all of you. I was looking a little bit into the difficulties that the Akeida, the binding of Yitzchak, at the end of the parsha, caused some of the various philosophers. If you know that Søren Kierkegaard wrote I guess you'd call it, I don't know if it's a full book about the Akeida. And I don't know if it was a book or what it was that he wrote on it, but Immanuel Kant also wrote about the Akeida. They were troubled, and one of the things I think that, if I understand correctly, what troubled them is something that should not trouble us. What troubled them was the dilemma that how a human being could face when he's faced with God's command versus what he knows to be moral. And this dilemma about which these philosophers wrote is based on, I guess you would say, a misunderstanding of what God is and what our relationship to him is. For us, or for many people, and I'm not a student of Kant or Kierkegaard to be able to say that this definitively is the way they looked at it, but mankind generally, even those who believe in God, sort of have what I would call a Superman vision of God. He is us, but in magnified form, and his abilities are much greater, and we have this idea that he is like man, but a Superman, just beyond. That's how we envision God and his powers. And this leads people to, as Rabbi Noach Weinberg used to like to say, that people say that I don't want to bother God with my prayers for things that aren't that important. And Rabbi Weinberg used to say, he says, there's no difference to God whether or not the planets collide, or you have wavy potato chips or ridged potato chips. There's no difference to him in difficulty, and it's not because he's Superman. That's not why. It's because he is qualitatively and quantitatively existing in a whole different plane, in a whole different way. And he is the source, not just of our existence, but the source of all existence. And it doesn't even make any sense for us to say there is a moral imperative outside of God. You can have a question on God. How do we square his command with other commands and other morals that he seems to dictate to us? Those are valid questions. But about what to do, the ultimate moral imperative is God's command itself, because our entire existence is only an extension of his will. And this another point that I know that these philosophers struggled with was the idea of how did Abraham know for certain that he really heard God? And that's a very interesting question. How is it that a prophet knows that God actually spoke to him? How does he know when he wakes up in the morning and thinks God spoke to him? How did he know it wasn't just some Chinese food he had last night? Maybe someone slipped a psychedelic mushroom into his into his um, into his dinner. Who knows? How do you really know? So I think that there's a sort of a philosophical answer to this, and then there's I would call it the proof from the Torah itself. That is that when a prophet and a navi experiences nevuah, it wasn't just God speaking to him. Because God is the source of all reality, when a person has a nevuah, they are more certain of their nevuah than they are of even of their own existence. Or I should say, maybe it verifies their own existence, because they are in touch directly with the ultimate reality. Everything else outside of God is created in this world. All of spirituality, all of physical reality, these are all creations. These are all things that God willed into existence. The only thing, as Rambam refers to the term as muchar chametzias, the only thing that absolutely exists is God himself. And when God is in direct communication with a human being, that human being is in touch with the ultimate reality. It's a sense of reality that's beyond anything else in human experience. And therefore, it isn't something that's possible to doubt. That experience is, a person is, Descartes said, how do I know that I really exist? Maybe everything is just a dream. Well, except when a person has nevuah. When a person has prophecy and they're in touch with the ultimate reality, that experience is more real than anything else in their experience. And it's not open to uncertainty because the person's in touch with the ultimate reality. The proof I like to bring to this is the mitzvah in the Torah of Navi Sheker, of a false prophet. And the law, as laid out in Book of Devarim, is in Shoftim, Parsha Shoftim, is that if a person makes a false prophecy and it doesn't come to be the prophecy that they make, it's a capital offense. They get killed. It's the death penalty. So imagine a person wakes up in the morning and they believe that God spoke to him and told them to go do or say such and such and predict such and such. Who in their right mind would go ahead and make the prophecy? I'm better off holding back the prophecy, although holding back the prophecy is also a sin, but it's not a capital offense. It's death at the hands of heaven. It's not as severe. So I'm better off not saying anything because I'm in doubt. How do I know? Like I said before, maybe it's the Chinese food I had. So how do I really know? So the way that I know is because it's the ultimate sense of touching the ultimate reality. That's the only way that it makes sense that the Torah could give such a command that we should utter a prophecy that we heard, because otherwise, if we weren't absolutely sure it was true, we would always be risk averse. And why would we ever take the chance? We're better off. We don't know. Maybe it's something I imagined. The only answer is that it's not possible, because so when Avram Avinu heard from Hashem himself to offer up his son, there was no question whether he had heard it. There was no question about what the moral issue was. He had no choice but to obey. Now, this is without getting into the whole issue of what was God doing here, what was the mechanics of the test. And a more interesting question is, even if Avraham Avinu heard it himself, but how did Yitzchak, once he realized that he was the offering, how did he listen to Avraham? He didn't hear it from He didn't hear it from God himself. He should have jumped off that altar, grabbed a knife, right? Not he screamed. He should have protested. How did he willingly offer himself up? Avraham Avinu could do it because he heard it directly from God. But how did Yitzchak do this? I actually posed this question to my late Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Yaakov Ruderman Zechron Livracha, and he informed me of a Gemara, that the Gemara asked this question in Sanhedrin, and explained that there is a concept of that once a person is an established Navi, an established prophet, such as Avraham Avinu, a person is allowed to take his word on, and the person is allowed to listen to what the Navi says, even if it seems to violate something in the Torah. If the Navi is established as a Navi, that's what the Gemara says. We don't have time to get into it properly, but there's sometime, if you're interested, I could share it with you. It's just there's simply not enough time for it now. A fascinating explanation of the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer explains exactly the mechanics of how it was that Avraham Avinu and Yitzchak Avinu, how it was that they could somehow misunderstand what God was commanding them. God commanded them, as Rashi says at the outset, all he did was command them to bring him up. It didn't say to slaughter him. So how did they make this mistake? And how did they come to understand their mistake? And what was the nature and the difference between Abraham's test, who heard it directly from God, and the test of Yitzchak, who didn't hear it from God? That those were two very different concepts, two very different ideas. These are all things that are worthwhile exploring. But Rabbi Alt, I think I should hold it here. And anyone is interested, they should feel free to contact me. I'd love to share this Chasam Sofer. I believe it's a very, very fundamental idea.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Spetner. I wanted to add, you mentioned the idea of, we see clearly that Avram Avinu must have had absolute clarity that his nevuah was indeed a nevuah for him to act upon it and execute the Akeida. So I came across the Rambam and the More Nevuchim. He apparently says he's addressing the question, why does Hashem test people at all? Hashem already knows himself what the person's capable of. Why does he bother? So the Rambam's approach is it's to teach us the certain fundamental lessons. And one of the points that he makes about the Akeida is that we learn from the Akeida the clarity that a Navi must have when he receives a nevuah. Because why else would Avram have done such an action, such a shocking thing, unless he was 100% clear about it?
It's interesting. I was once searching in the Moreh Nevuchim to see where he might discuss this idea that I was saying, that from the idea of a false prophet, that would be a proof to this idea. I'm wondering, maybe you'll point me to where that was in the Moreh Nevuchim. I'd like to see whether or not he, I once searched the Moreh Nevuchim to try to see if he would discuss this point, because it just seemed to me very obvious that a proof. But it's interesting that he brings the proof from Avraham himself.
Okay. All righty. So then that's reason enough to continue. Okay. All righty, go ahead. Let's see this. So this isn't his chidushim, I presume.
No, actually, it's fascinating. No, I'll tell you where it is. It's actually the very last tshuva, the very last responsa of that he has in Orach Chaim, and it's actually the Rav Tzihar Shchius wrote a book or maybe a pamphlet called Toras HaNeviim, which is an examination of all the issues, the halachic issues involving prophecy. And the Chasam Sofer wrote a book review and sent him a book review of it. Now, albeit I wouldn't call it a book review, it's more that he took points that Maritz Chias or Tzihar Shchias wrote in his book, and he commented on them and told him like some of his Torah about these issues that he touched on. So one of the issues he talked about was Yitzchak and Abraham and the Akeida. So the Chasam Sofer writes as follows. First of all, first thing he makes a point is that the nature of the test to Abraham and the nature of the test to Yitzchak are fundamentally different. Yitzchak, Abraham hearing it directly from Hashem, he refers to that as the metaphor he uses for it. I don't know if it's a metaphor. I'd say it's more than a metaphor. When he describes it, is it's a test of Torah Shebiksav, of hearing it directly from Hashem. He says Yitzchak, because he was relying on the presumption of the Navi, it was a test of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of believing the human being who Hashem has given the authority to. And therefore, it's really a Torah Sheba'al Peh test. It's just the test of Avram Avinu is to see whether or not he will be loyal to the word of Hashem directly, and the test for Yitzchak is whether he will be loyal to the directive of the human being who is empowered by Hashem, which is what the Torah Sheba'al Peh is. And he says a couple of very fascinating things in here. First, he gets into the issue of mechanics of how the test of the Akeida happened. That is, he says like this. He says, it's clear that Avraham and Yitzchak, who on their own, without being commanded, brought sacrifices to Hashem, that they understood the metaphysical ramifications of what sacrifices were all about. All the esoteric ideas, that if you open up the new art school translation of Ramban, of Nachmanides' commentary in Vayikra, there are sections at the beginning where they don't translate them because they are of complete mystical ideas, and that Karbanos, Rambam himself writes at the end of, and actually some Sofer quotes this, some Sofer actually makes a very strong statement at this point. He says that even though the Rambam writes in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed, that the rationale for Karbanos is to draw people away from Avodah Zarah, from idol worship, he says that was only lahashkit lev hahedyotim. That was only to quiet the hearts of the simple people. In other words, he said his attitude about the Moreh Nevuchim was it was the outreach sefer. It was the outreach work of his time. It was to explain the Torah along the lines of how to explain it from Aristotelian logic. But obviously, he says, even the Rambam, even the great rationalist of the Rambam, understood that Karbanos were not something that had a real, true rational explanation. And he cites the Rambam's halacha at the end of Hilchos Me'ilah, where the Rambam says very clearly that the Karbanos are a chok. There are things that we don't really understand the rationales behind them. They're mystical in their nature. So he says, sometimes it doesn't use the word mystical, obviously. I mean, the Rambam read, but he says that there are things beyond our capacity to understand. And as such, the nature of Karbanos are something that's a very deep idea. And it's something that Yitzchak and Avram themselves, as great Chachamim, he says, understood, just like they understood how to keep the Torah before it was given, because they understood the nature of the world at a very, very deep level. So they also understood the nature of Karbanos. And therefore, says the Chasam Sofer, they understood the nature of Karbanos, that human sacrifice was not something that was appropriate. That was native to them. So then comes along Hashem and tells them to bring him up as an Ola. So says the Chasam Sofer, there is a fundamental difference between a human being being an Ola, an a Ola sacrifice, and an animal being an animal sacrifice. If he says, I think maybe he quotes this Ramban at the beginning of Vayikra. He says, in order for it to be Ishe Riach Nichoach LaHashem, to be, which is the culmination of a carbon, that it's Ishe Riach Nichoach, it's a burnt up. A animal needs to be, as he says, have hefshit v'nituach v'chol leishim, needs to be flayed, cut up in this particular pieces, and burnt wholly on the altar. Holy with the W. So it needs It needs that in order for it to achieve its Ishi Reach Nechoach LaHashem. It hasn't achieved it without it. But that's because, and he doesn't really say this, but I think this is when you realize that this is what he means, that's because an animal has no bechira. It has no free choice. It's even though its owner makes a decision, but the animal itself, the actualization of the carbon, can't actualize anything without some physical act, which is the burning it on the mizbeach, on the altar. A human being, though, however, who his primary is his ability to make bechira chavshis, to make free will choices. Once he makes the choice to give up his life for Hashem, he is an Ola. It doesn't need the actualization in order for him to be an Ola. He's an Ola the moment he decides that he's going to give up his life for Hashem. He is an Ola. He is a sacrifice. He is a carbon. He doesn't need an actualization. He is able to make that decision. That's his actualization. He is at that point an Ola. He doesn't need more than that. However, there's a conundrum. And the conundrum is that you can't give up your life unless you think you really have to give up your life. Therefore, the only way for him truly to be an Ola, which is what Hashem said, Ola, bring him up as an Ola. Rashi right there says, it didn't say to slaughter him, it said just to bring him as an Ola. But the only way of doing that is if you actually think that you have to lose his life. So what did Hashem do? The test was Hashem removed from their brains. He gave them like a sort of amnesia, like they forgot this distinction between humans and animals. In terms of this distinction that we just talked about, is something that was nelam, that was hidden from them during the point of from the commandment and on. They suddenly forgot that part, and because of that, they thought he had to be sacrificed, and therefore he thought he was giving up his life, and therefore he was truly able to give up his life. He really became an Ola. Comes along. Actually, this is a fascinating thing. Many years ago, Cricket Schwartzberg asked me a question, which I think Mefarshim asked, and that was, how is it that Hashem commands Avram Avinu to bring him as a sacrifice, and a malach, an angel, comes along and tells him not to? How is an angel, which is a lower level of nevuah, how does that come along and contradict what Hashem said? And the answer is very simple. All the malach was really doing was taking away the amnesia. All of a sudden he remembered, he's brought as an Ola. He is an Ola already. There's no need to do anything more. That was the mechanics of how it was accomplished to have a nisayon, a test that involved, but he was an Ola. There was no stira, there's no contradiction between the commandment Hashem gave at the beginning and what he said at the end. It was all only just that he should be giving up his life without actually giving up his life. But the only way of accomplishing that is through this methodology. So the Chasam Sofer says that the nisayon of Yitzchak, though, was to believe Avram Avinu, and was this idea of emunas chacham. There's more to say about this. He has a nice piece on Purim in there as well, how they believed in Mordechai and why they believed Mordechai, but that we can save for a different time. And if there's anybody who has, whatever, okay, I want to leave that. I'll leave the rest of the. But that's the basic gist of this Sofer. I think it's the most clear explanation of the Akeida that I have ever encountered, and to me, it answers almost basically all the questions of that are involved in the Akeida.
Wow! And again, this is the last Tshuva in Orach Chaim, you said?
Yeah, now it's a long piece. He's got a lot of different pieces in there. Some of my favorite Torah is in that thing. So my favorite Dvar Torah, Parshas Truma, is in that piece. He's got just one fantastic piece after another. There's some Sofer there. Just incredible stuff.
Wow, something I wonder. I mean, it's not specific to the Chasam Sofer's approach, but the idea of the aisle, the ram taking Yitzchak's place. that would imply that there was some type of hefshit v'chitoch, that there was supposed to be some type
There
of.
is something. I mean, the Kabbalist farms say that actually the neshama of Yitzchak went into the aisle. It was Parcha Nishmaso at the time when, at that moment when he was about to slaughter him, his neshama went into the aisle, and he received the neshama of his mother, of Sarimane, who died at that moment. That's actually, if you look in the, not in the Oz v'Hadar B'Karos Gedolos, but in the Ma'or B'Karos Gedolos, at the bottom of the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, there's like footnotes, and one of them there quotes some sources that about this idea about the switching of the neshamas, and they point out that I heard Diane Donner once speak about this idea that what really happened was that Avram Avinu thought that the Akeida was the end of the line, but the reality was that there was a gender problem in their souls, and that was that he had this, that Yitzchak really had the soul of a nekeva, and was therefore going to be unable to have children. And the reason that Sarah was unable to have children was because she had to have a miracle in order to have a child, was because she actually says she had no womb, was she had a male soul, and that male soul went into Yitzchak. Yitzchak's female soul went into the aisle, and he was only able to have children, and that's why Rivka suddenly comes up in the parsha right afterwards, because he couldn't have gotten married before that. He wouldn't have had any children. It's only once he had the soul switch that he was capable of fathering children, and that. So really, when Avram Avinu thought that the Akeida was the end of the line, it was really the beginning of the line. In other words, he didn't understand that only through the Akeida was it possible for him to for Am Yisrael to come into existence. Not just because it needed the zuchus, the merit of it, but also because it needed the mechanics, the soul mechanics. It only worked because of the switching of the souls. That's the Kabbalistic approach behind how the Akeida works. And just when you think that things are not working out your way, right, is exactly when it works out. It's had to happen exactly this way. Sometimes you get the opportunity to see the story behind the scenes. Sometimes you don't.
That's right. Wow. Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Spetner. I feel
My
like
pleasure.
we got like 2 or 3 classes in one. But
Yeah.
I enjoyed every bit of it.
I will say, I really shouldn't say this, but I can't help it. But I realized I have to say that everyone has their bathroom reading. Well, on Shabbos, so I can't whatever. I have a special reading, so I have read some Harry Potter, and I had a revelation a couple months ago when I realized that J.K. Rowling was actually used part of this same logic. For those who are into that, I can tell you that Harry had to think that he was giving up his life, even though he really wasn't giving up his life. That was the only way that he was able to. She used this.
She must have been holding the Chasam Sofer.
That's what it seems like. Me and my daughter joke about this.
Oh, gewaldig. Okay, thank you again so much, Rabbi Spetner.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining and sticking around, all of you. I appreciate it.
All right, have a wonderful Shabbos. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Very good. Thank you, everyone. Good Shabbos.